everybody, I'm Sara Gallegos and this is Serger Saturday. I'm so excited to share with you some of my favorite ways to utilize a serger in quilt making. In our first episode, we talked about how to achieve that perfect 1/4" seam using a serger. And today we're going to talk about how you can utilize some of the fun, fancy stitches and decorative threads on your serger to add to your quilt blocks. So one of the questions that we got, and of course we'd love it if you'd give us questions so that I can answer them in a future episode, but one of the questions that we received from you was, why make a quilt on a serger instead of on a sewing machine? And I always say, hey, because I can. I love when I can play with all different types of machines in my sewing hobbies. But one of my favorite reasons I kind of touched on earlier is the fact that we can use decorative threads and do some really fun exposed seams. So typically when we're quilting on our sewing machine, we're sewing with our fabrics right sides together, and when we open it up, all of our seams are hidden. Well, with a serger, we can kind of flip it around a little bit and do some neat things where we use exposed seams for decorative accents. So I want to start by talking to you a little bit about how you can utilize a flatlock stitch in quilt making. And I'll show you as an example real quick of what I've got here. This is a common serger stitch that you're going to find on a lot of overlock machines. Now you'll see a flatlock stitch in knitwear. Oftentimes this is what you'll find in a raglan sleeve t-shirt or maybe even down the sides of your favorite yoga pants. But it's also a lot of fun to play with decorative stitches and using this flatlock stitch. The stitch itself is reversible. So here with the red, you'll see one side of the stitch and it just kind of looks like your serger thread looping over the edges. And then here where you see the blue thread, it looks kind of like a ladder. And that is the other side of a flatlock stitch. So I'll get a little bit closer here. Maybe you can see both of those next to each other. So those are the two different parts of a flatlock, and it's a lot of fun to play with. Now I am actually working with a decorative thread in my needle and in my looper. I'm using a 2-thread flatlock stitch, in which case I've got only my lower looper and a needle thread. And a lot of sergers can do that by utilizing what's called the subsidiary looper. It's a little bit more advanced technique, but it's a lot of fun to play with. And when you utilize that subsidiary looper, you omit the upper looper thread, and it kind of pulls the needle thread down and makes it do 2 different jobs. So the 2 threads that I'm playing with here are a 12 weight Decora thread. So it's a heavier weight rayon. Now most of your serger threads are about a 40 weight polyester. They come on those tall cones of serger thread just like this, but we do have the option of playing with decorative threads as well. So that's what I've got here. Now when you're using those decorative threads, it would not sit on top of one of the cone holders. So you actually take those cone holders off. They just pop right off just like this, right? And sometimes you find them inside of your serger cones of thread. And instead, you're going to utilize a spool cap. Now my serger, which happens to be a Baby Lock Ovation, comes with 2 different types of spool caps. And one of them has foam on it and one does not. So I'll show you a close up here. This guy has foam, this guy does not. And when you're using a spool cap like this, it's designed to hold the thread. It almost acts like a little bumper for your threads. And then the non-foam sided can go on top of it, and that will keep your thread from bouncing up and down as you stitch. Now, if you have a thread that's really slippery and kind of wants to fall down the spool, sometimes you'll see that the threads drop down and wrap right around the spool pins, and that can cause problems. So most sergers also come with thread nets. And these are designed to go right over top of the spool of thread to prevent that slipping of thread from happening. So I'll put one on here and show you. So you can go right over top of the spool of thread, and I've got my spool cap on there. If I can just separate the net and get my hand in there, then you can slide it right on, and that will prevent those threads from falling down the spool. Gravity sometimes wants to pull it down, but now that thread couldn't possibly go down because the net's kind of holding it nice and tight. So again, you can play with lots of different types of threads on your serger. You're not limited to those cones of serger thread, but sometimes you need a couple of extra tools to make the job a little easier, and that could be your spool caps and your thread net. So I'm going to share with you how we can utilize this flatlock stitch in quilting. So I've got the blocks here all cut out, and I'm going to show you first what it looks like with our flatlock stitch when we sew with our fabrics right sides together. Now, we talked last week about how you can measure your seam allowances to make sure you've got a nice 1/4 inch. I've already done that, and I know that with this stitch and the settings that I have on my serger, I need to skim just a little bit of fabric off as I stitch. So you'll notice I'm cutting just a little bit. So it was just a teeny little bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And now when I open this up and kind of give a little tug to my fabric, so you have to give it a little tug to expose those flat locks, then you'll see that I've got those pretty little ladders that pop right out. So that is what one side of the stitch looks like. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my second bar onto my little kind of quarter log cabin block here. Once again, I'm going to go right sides together. And I'm going to skim off just a little bit. And again, you can measure your seam allowances and make sure you're cutting off the right amount. There we go. Now, so that's what the wrong side of that flat lock looks like. And here, give it that little pop. We have our exposed flat lock stitch. So kind of fun. But again, this stitch is reversible. So I want to share with you now what it looks like if we sew with our fabrics wrong sides together. So this may feel a little unusual for you, especially if you make a lot of quilts. Sewing wrong sides together maybe kind of feels wrong, but it's going to give us a really neat effect. Make sure I nudge my fabrics. There we go. And now, when I pop it open, you'll see that we have that pretty red thread showing. Kind of blends a lot, but there you go. So instead of having the look of the blue ladders, we have just an encased seam with the red thread. And then once again, I would take my next piece and attach it. Now I kind of trim my thread tails as I go just to get them out of the way, but the beauty of the serger is with stitches like this, it's cutting as it sews. So it's going to trim off those little extra thread tails. I'll kind of show you as we go here because I got a little bit of a thread tail right here. My machine's going to take care of that for me. I don't have to worry about it at all. Go. So here is my sewn seam, and again I'm just going to give it that little pop, tug it open, and there we have the beginnings of our quarter log cabin block. So again, that's working with a flat lock stitch. Now there are a couple of different variations on flat locks. You'll probably see that your machine can do a flat lock narrow. That would mean that the right needle is in, or a flat lock wide, which would mean that the left needle is in. That's what I'm working with. So you want to make sure that based on which stitch you choose, that you do test that 1/4 inch seam allowance so that your blocks come out nice and square. I do typically press them and kind of square them up as I go. I find that taking that little extra step of trimming my blocks as I piece tends to make them look a little bit better in the long run. Now, there are also 3-thread flat lock stitches where instead of using that subsidiary looper like I described, you would put your upper looper thread in. Any one of those effects can be really beautiful in quilt making. Next, I want to share with you what it looks like when you use a wave stitch for piecing. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to start by kind of just rethreading the machine. I don't actually need to rethread my lower looper. I'm going to leave that just as it is. And I'm actually going to take my thread net off because I want to make sure that there's nothing pulling on my thread. And this particular thread doesn't really super need it. There we go. And I'm going to thread for a wave stitch. Now, the fun thing about sergers is that every single different stitch that you work with is based off of tension. That can be the most challenging part of sergers, right? Is because you've got to get all those tension settings correct, but it also gives you the most variation in your stitches. Now, sometimes to get a unique stitch, you might find that you have to utilize a unique threading path. And that's the case with a flat lock on all sergers and also a wave stitch. So I always keep handy the instructions. This is actually a little guide that tells me how to thread my machine. And I make sure that I've always got that with me when I'm working with my serger so that I don't forget to set something in a particular setting. That way I can make sure that I get everything set exactly the way that it needs to be. Typically you'll find that it tells you, how to position your threads and your threading paths. So it's really helpful to make sure you've got your instructions handy. I kind of pulled back on that, so I'm going to get rid of a little bit of the slack in my thread. We don't want to have any serger thread parties is what I call it, when those threads kind of twist up together. They can cause little problems. There we go. And now I'm going to add one more thread to the party here. That's going to be my upper looper going back into position. And I do need to move my needle. I've been working with my needle in the left position, and I'm just going to move it over to the right. So real quick and easy. Perfect. And now all I've got left to do is that looper. Now for my wave stitch, I don't follow the usual threading path of the upper looper. It's kind of a little bit unusual. So if you know baby lock sergers and you see that I just put that thread in the wrong spot for my upper looper, it's actually in the right spot for this stitch. There we go. I think we've done it. I always like to keep a little sample of fabric nearby when I am stitching on my serger, just so that I can test my stitches. It's a really important step in the process to make sure that you're happy with your settings. So I'm going to run down the edge here. And I'm getting a really nice wave stitch. What this stitch does is about, every 20 stitches, it kind of flip-flops who's in charge between the upper looper and the lower looper. So I see the red and the blue thread kind of every other little bump there in the waves. Now, I think that this looks just a little bit too sparse. I can see some of my white fabric showing through behind those threads. And all I need to do to fix that is simply make my stitch length shorter. This is why you always want to do a test, because then you can really make sure you're happy and satisfied with the results. Now, if your stitches look too bunched up and too thick, stretch your stitch length out, make it longer. If it looks too sparse, make it shorter. You can control a lot with that stitch length dial. Okay, I'm happier with that. Trip my thread here. Oh, yes, I have a nice, beautiful wave stitch, so we can see the red and the blue thread just kind of taking turns covering the edge of the fabric. So let me show you how I would use this now to create a quilt block. Now, working with that wave stitch, that's an exposed seam. So I am going to stitch with my fabric wrong sides together and then pull that open. And I'm also going to work with the center square facing up. Now, when you're working with a stitch like this, you want to make sure that as you keep building around your block, the same fabric is facing up. So it's going to be that center square. And again, I want to just trim a tiny little bit off as I stitch. Now I have my stitch width set to an M, and I'm literally skimming about 1/8 of an inch of fabric off, and that's what gives me with this stitch a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, you just want to test that out. And I'm going to cut my little thread tails there and take a look. And now I have that beautiful wave stitch running between my two pieces of fabric. So you can see that this kind of sticks up. It's a dimensional stitch. It's stitched on the 2 layers and it sticks up. So I would simply give that a good press and then add your second piece on. So once again, I'm going to work with my center square face up, and I'm putting my fabrics wrong sides together. And I'm going to stitch right over that previous seam. Now, sometimes people get a little bit nervous when they're about to stitch over an existing seam, especially with one that's dimensional like this. So I want to just make sure that it pulls down so that all of my waves are exposed, and you'll see that it'll stitch just fine over those thicknesses of thread. Go. And once again, I've got that beautiful exposed wave stitch. It is dimensional, so I would press that. In fact, I can even use my little fabric folding pen here. I'm just going to run it right in the seam. There we go. And then just give it a little press. And you'll find that your pieces will lay nice and flat. So here I have used the wave stitch to create this entire block. Isn't that fun? So I just kept working with my fabrics wrong sides together and building it with that center square in the top position, and that ensured that all of those pretty little waves were all facing in the right direction when the block was complete. Now, just another little example of what you can do with these stitches. For these, I was working with a 12 weight thread, but those rayons and cotton threads also come even heavier than that. So this is about a 6 weight of the same type of thread. Here I've used that wave stitch again, and I've stitched over all my seams to make this little courthouse steps block, and it made just a really fun little Halloween project. Also on here, I have a rolled hem with really thick thread in it, so that's another really fun option. This whole block is not pieced. I literally just took a large square of fabric and I folded it, and I stitched that beautiful rolled hem right on the fold, and then when I laid it flat, I got a really neat, like, decorative stitched block. And then here, I used the Flatlock stitch. So we were working with that Flatlock stitch first. That's the underside of the Flatlock stitch, and that's what it looks like with just a little bit heavier thread in the loopers and something that you can really see on the surface of your fabric. So there are lots and lots of different options when it comes to quilting with your serger. You can utilize those basic seams like we did last week and make all of your seams hidden and just have really traditional looking quilt blocks. Or you can kind of kick it up a notch, play with some of your favorite decorative threads, and use them for seams that you'll see on the right side of the project. It just gives you a little added flair to your quilts. Now, there are lots of different types of threads that you can play with. You can use your favorite embroidery threads. Those are a little thinner, so you'll probably find that you want a shorter stitch length in order to get that filled in look. You can also play with heavier weight threads, and maybe you want to use a nice long stitch length because it gives you more of like a picot effect instead of just completely encasing the edge of your fabric with those threads. So the sky's the limit when it comes to possibilities when you're playing with the decorative stitches on your serger in your quilt making. Just cut a few extra pieces, test out those stitches, and see what you like the best. I'm so glad that you have watched this Serger Saturday video with me. Please be sure to leave us some questions so that I can answer those for you in an upcoming video. And in our next Serger Saturday video, we'll be talking about how you can use your serger for quilting.